All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for 15,000 subscribers. It's a pretty insane number to think about. Last week, I went to go see Theo Vaughn, and it was at a pretty big venue. And at the end of the show, he mentioned that there were 7,000 people there. And it put into perspective how much 15,000 actually is. That's a ton of people. You can't really wrap your head around that until you see it in person. So to see a little less than half of that in person and just how many people that was, and then to double it and see that that's what the channel's at now, it's pretty humbling and it's pretty cool. And it was just a nice perspective to see. So thanks everybody, every single one of you. You guys have been sticking around here for a while, and I genuinely do appreciate all of that. Doing this stuff it's fun. This is what I nerd out doing. So to basically have a platform where I can nerd out and talk about lifting and have people want to like chip into the conversation in the comments and watch the videos, it really is cool, and I really do appreciate it. And I know a lot of you guys are kind of similar to me in that way. So let's get right to it. And just in case anyone here is new, basically the way that I run my Q&As is if you have a question that you want to see answered in a Q&A, leave it in the comment section of this video. If you see another question that you like and that you want to see answered, give it an upvote, and that will make it more likely that I see it and that I decide to put it in the next Q&A. I always pick the top rated comments, and then I always pick a few more that I think are good questions, even if nobody else saw them. From Adrian Pearson, how important are rest days? GVS says you don't really need them. Keen to get your thoughts. Great channel, by the way. So thanks, man. I think when it comes to rest days, this primarily is going to be situational. A quote that I heard from Steve Shaw probably 4 or 5 years ago when I was a relatively new lifter is that you shouldn't be looking to do more work on your rest days and seeing them as an opportunity to do more work. You should have rest days in your program because you need them to actually recover to be able to match your performance. With that said, a practical answer I'd give you is it depends on your split. I think if you're doing something like an intense, like jam-packed upper-lower split or a full body split, generally days that are like compact and kind of jammed with a bunch of lifts, usually 7, 8, or even 9 lifts per session. If you're running a split like that, in my experience, you're at least going to need 1 or 2 rest days per week, especially with full body. If you're doing like big intense sessions, you probably need 3, if not 4 rest days per week. If you're running something that's closer to more of a bro split on that side of the spectrum where you're doing lower frequency per muscle, you just don't accumulate as much systemic fatigue, because it's like if you're training one day is arms, then the next day is shoulders. It's like you're dedicating each day to a smaller muscle group, and your muscles recover within 48 to 72 hours max anyways. So I think with those, you just have less systemic fatigue, you have less of a need for off days, and you actually have more of a requirement to be in the gym more since your frequency is already low in the first place. You can't really miss a session. So I hope that helped answer your question. Next question from Recreational Lifting. Congratulations. What's your method in learning whether a new exercise movement actually helps you grow a muscle? Do you swap an older movement in place for a new one for a certain amount of time or a certain amount of months and go from there? Great job, my man. So I appreciate that a ton, man. Thanks for following the channel. I'd say when it comes to figuring out which lift is going to be the one that's giving me the results, I did talk about this a little bit in my last Q&A from one of my clients, Dan. He had a good question on that. I would say when it comes to figuring out if a lift is actually giving me results, a lot of this just comes down to understanding biomechanics and actually having some hands-on experience with lifting for a decent amount of time. I'm at a point where I have a pretty good understanding of how the body works and how each muscle's anatomy works, as well as like short and long positions of a muscle and resistance profile. So once you kind of have that knowledge down, you can get a pretty good educated guess on what each lift is doing. So you can get a good guess on like what lifts are good and what lifts you should probably avoid. So I would argue that you don't necessarily need to do direct correlations between the lift and your results at that time. It is going to be pretty tough to measure outside of just measuring like progress photos and measurement trends along with your body weight and all that kind of stuff that I always advocate for. It's a lot of just knowing what you're going to get out of that lift before you do it based on lifts that are similar that you've done in the past, and just understanding the general mechanics of the lift. So that's a tough question to answer, but I would say do your best to record progress in every way you possibly can. I would also say that the less lifts that you have for a particular muscle, the easier it's going to be to tell. If you're doing one lift for chest throughout the week and you rotate that and you stop getting results, it could just be a bad lift, assuming you didn't change anything else with your program or your outside of the gym recovery and whatnot. But with that being said, if you're someone that does like say 6 lifts per week for your chest, where you're doing something like what Alex Leonidas does, where he does 2 to 3 lifts per day, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, that becomes a little bit more of a gray area because each lift chips in a little bit less. It's a smaller piece of the pie because you have so many more. So good question. That one's a little bit difficult to answer. Next question from Tommy Meyer. NH talked about the importance of a goal physique and that having a non-fiction representation of a physique is preferable over aspiring to look like other people. Are there any characters or fictional forms you desire to represent in your physique? So, no, I'm not a huge fiction fan. And at the time, I don't really have a goal physique. I'm in this weird like transition stage where I'm turning into an adult, I guess, where I don't really have like goal physiques or anything. I'm just trying to maximize my own time in the gym. It's strange because when I was younger, I would always have a goal physique or someone I was looking up to. But it's a weird kind of paradox where you need something to aspire to become, but at the same time, you can't try and become that exact thing. And I think that's where you have to find that happy medium between chasing a certain look or a certain aesthetic and also just chasing like mass and size and measurements. So I think if you see someone that has an 18-inch arm and you want your arm to look exactly that way, that's where it starts to mess with your head a little bit because your arm could be that same size as that person's, but it might look entirely different. So it's just a weird kind of balance that you have to find there. With that said, I don't have a goal physique right now, fiction or nonfiction. I'm in this weird in-between phase where I'm just kind of waiting for that next wave of whatever I want to do to come to me. So it's an interesting one for sure right now. Next question from Papa Smurf. If I'm progressing just okay with 6 sets per week and feeling okay, does adding a few more make sense from the hypertrophy standpoint, or is it better to keep those additional sets for the movement when they will be necessary to progress? I'm talking about intermediate lifters here, not complete novices. So this is a really good question. When it comes to adding volume and adjusting volume in your program, the first thing, it's a perfect time for the quote, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So if you're doing okay and you're making good progress and you're growing, don't change things up because you could end up sandbagging your lifts. You could run into recovery issues. And this isn't to say just adding a set here and there is going to like entirely destroy your program or make like massive changes. But with that being said, you want to keep in mind that the more sets you add to one thing, the more it takes away from something else. It could take away from that lift because of sandbagging and just when you have more opportunities to train a muscle and you have more sets to do, you're naturally you value each set less. So when you're kind of finding that sweet spot, you want to find the most amount of sets that you can maximize and not go to the point where you start to sandbag and just kind of half-ass your sets. You also have to keep in mind that if you add sets to one thing, it's taking away from potentially more sets on another lift or just adding in another lift altogether for another muscle group. When it comes to a practical piece of advice for this, I would say that picking your top priorities and adding sets to those as a like kind of a low risk, low reward investment isn't really a bad idea. So my general protocol for this is if you have, say, 10 major muscle groups that you'd like to break down within your program, pick 2 or 3 or even 1 to 3 top priorities and use those where you're a little bit more liberal with your volume. So if you're keeping everything at, say, 2 sets per lift per session, what I would do from there is pick maybe 2 to 3 muscle groups and 1 lift for each of those muscle groups where you either directly go up to maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 sets depending on the lift in some cases, or just work with like a triple progression rather than a double progression. So you're kind of just advancing to that next stage of progression, and that could work pretty well. So if you're running double progression on 2 sets and just milking out as much as you can between adding weight and reps as long as you can, it's not a bad idea to, like I said, take those 2 or 3 lifts, those 2 or 3 muscle groups, and just do a triple progression. So add weight, add sets, and add reps over time, and just kind of run those cycles over and over. If you're doing that for everything, it's probably a bit much, especially if you just spam that in your program. But start small and see how it goes. It shouldn't affect you too much. Next question from Chad Kirk. Number 1, why do you not do thumbless grip on reverse curls? So with that, I'm mostly just looking to work the radiobrachialis. So I don't want my wrist extensors to be my basically my reason for failure. I don't want them to be my limiting factor on that lift. So I don't want to worry about grip strength. I'm just trying to train the radiobrachialis, which isn't really involved with grip that much. So that's primarily why I do that. Number 2, he says, what is your stance on RIR, reps in reserve? For those of you that don't know, do you take everything to failure? I started really training my biceps 2 months ago, going to 1-0 RIR in the first 3 sets, and then going to failure on the last set. I'm talking real technical failure, like stalling for 5 seconds on a bicep curl. My biceps have grown a lot, but I've accumulated a lot of fatigue, psychological and physical. Now I'm losing a lot of reps in my curls. I'm now deloading for a week before starting back up again. I think I'll stay at 2 to 3 RIR and see how that goes. I'm an obese novice that is recomping, so maybe that has something to do with it. Thoughts? I would say that your sets are probably too high. I think doing 4 sets on a lift, especially for a novice, is a lot. It's okay to do like more warm-ups and more lighter sets if you need to like practice technique and just really refine it that way. But I would say in the vast majority of cases, just starting with 2 sets is fine. And what drives muscle growth is intensity, as in proximity to failure in the bodybuilding sense. So try 2 sets on everything and just go from there. I would also recommend strictening up your technique as much as possible. I don't think strictening as a word, but I think you know what I'm trying to say here. Keep your technique as strict as possible. Keep it local to your biceps and try not to use cheat form or cheat technique, and just go to 0 reps in reserve, maybe 1. You'll realize that when you have good technique and good tempo and everything's dialed in, you don't need to go all out way past failure and stall out on this last rep, especially if you're a beginner. A lot of the time with the right technique and the right execution, just going to 0 RIR is a pretty viable option, and that's what I do for the vast majority of my lifts. So that's what I would focus on. If you have to deload, you're probably doing a bit too much anyways. I would cut back a little bit. Next question from no username there, GHGJFRH, I think it says. I don't know why YouTube goes back and forth between like showing those handles versus someone's actual name. I feel like every time I do a Q&A, mine like switches to all handles and I can't actually like read them. He says, how much does exercise variety matter for optimal growth? As a specific example, I want to hit delts 8 to 10 sets per week while training them twice per week on each of my upper days. What would be better, performing 2 of the same exercises on each upper day and have 4 exercises, or have 4 exercises and rotate them and perform 2 of them on any given upper day? Thanks. This is a good question. I think it just comes down to your recovery and how injury prone you are, or just general staleness prone you are for that muscle or for that lift. For myself, there's some lifts that I can do twice a week and I'm perfectly fine doing that. Like, for example, my leg days, I'm doing them twice a week, and my 2 lifts for quads are hack squats and pendulum squats in a very similar rep range on both days. And I've been doing this for a couple months now, perfectly fine with no issues at all. For something like the lats, I don't know what it is, but the lifts go stale super quick if I do the same variation twice a week. So I do have to give a little bit more variety there. So what I'd say for you, it's not a bad idea to have more variety, but it's also not a bad idea just to try doing the same thing both times, especially if you're working well with that lift at the moment in time, and just see how long it lasts for. If it starts to feel a little funky, or maybe you get some nagging pains and overuse injuries in a month or something, it's probably better just to get some variety. It really can't hurt. But I do understand that when you find a lift that kind of clicks with you really well and you just enjoy doing it, it's tough to only do it once a week. So I'd say pick whichever one's more appealing to you. If you'd rather kind of have more variety and you prefer that and you want to be low risk, go with the 4 total lifts per week. If you want to just maximize a lift that's working really well for you right now, try repeating the same thing and see if it works, because it honestly might. Everybody's a little bit different. I know the general consensus is that you shouldn't repeat the same lift twice in a week. I'm kind of opposed to that. I don't really see why that's a thing. But with that being said, I know why it could be an issue, but I don't think it automatically is an issue. I think it just takes some experimenting. Next question from Ian Estocio. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right at all, so my bad, man. I do know your first name's Ian, though, so I'll stick with that. How's your level of activity at the moment? Are you doing any cardio or have a set number of steps that you do on a day-to-day basis? So I actually don't track my steps, and my activity level isn't that high. I'm probably not as healthy as I could be. I do obviously lift very often and very hard, so that does quite a bit for me. But with that being said, I don't have the most active lifestyle. I'm not someone that like goes out and runs or like rides my bike or something. I'm like generally active, just doing stuff around the house and the yard. But with that said, I think the only time I would actually consistently get like say 10,000 steps or like an actual session of cardio in regularly in a sustainable way is if I was just to go join like a men's league hockey or something, which I do want to do this winter. So that's what I'd be looking to do. But other than that, I don't have any step count goals or anything. I just kind of live my normal life and let lifting take care of most of it for me. Next question from Crispy Raha. Transitioning from a 6-day push-pull leg split to a 4 to 5 day upper lower arms. Do you have any advice with still being able to hit muscle groups 2 times a week without the workouts becoming exceptionally longer and not neglecting muscle groups? I'm already incorporating a lot of supersets and don't have much time left in the day to devote to much longer gym sessions if I make the switch. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, would be to switch from a push-pull leg split 6 days a week into a push-pull legs upper-lower. More specifically, an upper-lower push-pull legs is the precise split that I'm running at the moment. It works really well because you can train every muscle group with frequency, so that's what the upper and the lower sessions are for. Instead of doing push-pull legs, you compact it to 2 days. They are bigger days. They do cram in a decent amount of work with an upper-lower because you basically have 2 days to train your entire body, but the push-pull legs portion of that week allows you to train everything with a little bit more precision. This is great for intermediates and advanced lifters. And at the same time, you do get to reduce a day of frequency, and those push-pull leg sessions are going to be a little bit shorter if they're properly programmed. So that's what I'd say for you there. The only other tip that I would give you for this is instead of doing push as in chest, shoulders, triceps, swap triceps for biceps and put triceps on your pull day, and that way you can train your arms fresh. It's a split that just works really well. It kind of has that happy medium between an upper-lower and a push-pull legs, and I personally really enjoy it. So it sounds like that would just be a perfect split for you, man. Next question from Mohammed Naz. What's your take on the whole new low-volume HIT training style making a comeback, and could you clarify whether low volume is always better or higher volumes, 12 to 18 for example, is okay given that the person is still training with high enough effort, 0 to 2 reps in reserve? This is a really good question. HIT training, it has its pros and cons in my opinion. I think to start with the pros, we know what drives muscle growth, and that's mechanical tension, essentially proximity to failure. I know it's a term you guys are probably more familiar with. It's a little bit more tangible. So how hard do you train? And that's kind of what will determine how much you grow. From there, you have to decide how much work you need to grow. So once you know how hard you have to work, how much of that work do you need to grow? And how much do you need to grow? I'm going to ask you that. Nobody can answer that question because there's no context. And that's the problem with HIT, is that volume amounts is dependent on a few different things. So one, it's going to be the program. So what's your frequency? What's your exercise selection? Is rear delt fly the same as like an RDL? Do they both just get one hard set? Or do you think a rear delt fly maybe could benefit from going a little bit higher in volume, and maybe an RDL could benefit from just doing 1 or 2 sets? So it's definitely a flawed concept, and people are being generally a bit too dogmatic about something that is just lacks context. To expand on this a little bit more, I do think HIT can temporarily teach people to work harder, especially if you don't have that much quantity to overcome. So it can teach you how to work hard, and then from there you can kind of optimize your volume and scale things up as needed. I do think one thing to watch out for, and this is the red flag in my opinion with the whole HIT movement, is that these guys fearmonger the shit out of people with fatigue, which is just, it's a strange thing, because you know that's how they get you to fall into the trap of HIT, is fear mongering you through being worried about the big scary fatigue. Like, guys, I mean, I spammed that push pull legs program training hard as fuck for a very long time in like 2018, 2019, never deloaded, trained all out, everything like to failure. I was like your classic push-pull legs guy. I never got injured. I didn't make the best progress, but I never got injured. Technically, I never needed to deload. Maybe I should have, and I could have had better progress. But what I'm trying to say is you're not just, fatigue isn't going to kill you. It's not out to get you. These guys, a lot of the time, use fear-mongering tactics. I've seen on multiple occasions the HIT crowd be referred to as a cult or culty. So be careful with the extremes. It's definitely good to learn how to train hard. That ultimately is what drives growth. But at the same time, it's like you can't just work hard and not do enough of it and expect that to be fine. So it's a really strange thing. I think the reason for it making a comeback is because we're learning more about mechanical tension and proximity to failure / intensity driving growth. But the question that I ask people is like, okay, well, why just one set? Nobody can answer that question because there's no reason to just do one set. Like, why not two? Why not two, right? Why not two? That's my take on it. So figure out your effort and then figure out how much of that you need, and that will set you up pretty well. Don't rely on the extremes and be wary of fear-mongering from culty fitness people. Next question from Bambuzi. Any thoughts on powerlifting on a cut to pump up your numbers and maintain muscle mass with lower volume? Then back to bodybuilding on the bulk. Is it reasonable to expect muscle growth on a cut as an intermediate / advanced lifter? I feel like not really, therefore might as well hit PRs. So powerlifting, you're on the right track with your thinking, I think in a very similar way, just not with powerlifting. You have to make sure you're doing enough to maintain your muscle, but one thing that I'm an advocate of that probably goes a little bit against the grain, so with cutting, with my mini cuts, I like to either reduce my volume or rotate my lifts to stuff that is kind of like more of a mid-tier lift, as NH would say. This way you can let the primary lifts that you enjoy that work well for you kind of freshen up, and you're not really just wasting time and wasting overuse on lifts that you're not really getting anything out of anyways because it's a cut. With that said, I think powerlifting is probably a little bit of an extreme. You could probably do like a modified powerlifting if you wanted to. So maybe stick with like a deep high bar squat instead of just going for maximizing your performance output on those lifts, like a low bar, barely hitting parallel squat, dive bombing the eccentric. I would do that and see how that goes. It probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I would definitely make sure you're getting a moderate amount of volume and just work that is like use common sense and just make sure you're maintaining your muscles, what I'd say. But doing a little bit of powerlifting on a cut probably wouldn't hurt you. But with that said, you're probably not going to make the best progress on a cut anyways. So it's kind of up to you and how much of a priority powerlifting is for you. For the general person that's just wanting to be bigger, I wouldn't recommend powerlifting on a cut. But yeah, I do like the way you think. Next question from Jumbotron Poppin. What are your thoughts on Alex Leonidas' style of training? Low volume with high intensity. I'm intrigued by this approach as I've typically favored higher, quote unquote, volume, 14 to 20 sets per week. So I'm unfamiliar with his volume amounts, but I do know his style of training. He had a great video on why he does multiple lifts, but only 2 sets per. If I remember correctly, I don't think he does low volume. I think he does moderate volume. I know that's a very vague term, but I think he does, 8 to 12 sets per week per muscle group or something like that. That's probably what I'd consider it, like a moderate-ish volume amount. I think low volume's anything below like 5 sets a week, in my opinion. But I do like the high intensity, definitely, as I touched on in one of the previous questions about HIT, but most importantly, I like his high exercise variety. I think this is super important for intermediate and advanced lifters, and this is something that we can all benefit from as intermediate and advanced lifters. For beginners, it is maybe not the best thing because if you still need a lot of like coordination and skill work on your lifts to actually maximize growth and really start reaping the hypertrophy benefits, I do think it's better to go with a moderate volume and just pick a couple select lifts to really just get good at and master. If you're an intermediate or advanced lifter, like I was saying, Having more variety is key because you can keep your fatigue a little bit lower. As you get stronger, lifts tend to beat you up a little bit more. So having more variety, it's almost like a little loophole around it. So I think it's genius what he came up with, and in that video he made, I want to say it was like last year or something. So I'm all for it. I don't know the specifics on his volume amounts, but he's basically just doing whatever works for him because he has an incredibly good physique. So whatever he's doing is working, at least for him. He's a very strong guy too, so I wouldn't be shocked if he does have to go with a little bit lower volume. Next question from X Tiger. Is there any other intensity technique you are using besides partials? No, not at the moment. I'm not a huge fan of intensity techniques aside from partials. Next question from BSO. What are some intermediate level mistakes you see a lot? Everyone always talks about beginner mistakes, but I never really hear people talk about what's holding you back from getting to the next level. That's a great question. So there's a few that come to mind, probably too many to just put in this Q&A, but another banger of a question from BSO per usual. So I'll probably end up making a video on this, and I think this will be your fifth video idea of my channel's existence already. So I would say the first one is far and away, it's basically what my channel's about. As you guys know, it's about kind of just switching into powerlifting or power building when the gains start to slow down a little bit. And these guys, a lot of the intermediates, think they have to just get freakishly strong and just stick to barbells to continue to grow, which is just, it's complete nonsense. And there's really no logic behind it. I was the classic case of a victim of that kind of mindset. So not to be redundant and repeat what I've already talked about on the channel for a year and a half, I would say another issue is focusing and worrying too much about mind-muscle connection. A lot of intermediates really like to kind of feel their lifts and get a good pump. This isn't something that you really have to worry about too much, because as long as execution is set up properly, so your technique is good and your actual setup for the lift is good, where the resistance is coming from the right way and you have proper technique to basically handle that load, you should be fine. And mind muscle connection isn't anything special. It's correlated with good technique, but it's not required. This happens a lot of the time, I find, in back training, where a lot of people just don't really feel their backs that much, because I don't know exactly what it is. It's probably like less nerves or something in your back. But if you were to like flex your tricep or flex your bicep, where it's a muscle that's kind of close to your brain, you can see it. It's a small muscle group that you can flex really well. You can just feel it a lot more, versus if you like try and flex your back, you can feel it, but it's kind of numb at the same time. Like if you were to even just pinch your skin on your tricep and then pinch your skin on your back, they feel entirely different. So I think a lot of people get caught up in like trying to feel their lifts too much, trying to feel the mind muscle connection too much, when it's probably just a waste of time and could actually be holding you back from just focusing on what matters most, which is execution and technique. Another mistake I would say that intermediates make a lot of the time is brushing off things like biomechanics. I don't think biomechanics is the end-all be-all, but at the same time, when you're an intermediate, you're kind of at that point where you have more ability to really just kind of customize your physique, like focus on certain parts of the lats or the upper chest and stuff like that. And I think a lot of the time, a lot of intermediates just write off biomechanics entirely. And the problem with this thinking is exactly what happened to myself, where I was like, squat equals quads, deadlift equals posterior chain, bench equals chest, shoulders, triceps. And you kind of fall into this mindset where you associate a certain muscle with a certain lift. And it might not necessarily be wrong, but you also have to understand the differences of things like a low bar squat doesn't really optimally train your quads. And a lot of people, like even just saying the word optimal, people would make fun of me for that. And at the same time, I'm the guy that was repping out 405 on squats, and now I get people telling me that my legs are too small to even be giving training advice. So if that says anything, I think it's pretty important actually understanding how to train each muscle. Beginners can get away with a lot of maybe subpar lifts or suboptimal lifts or whatnot. But when you're an intermediate and the noob gains go away, you have to be more precise with your training. And that's the problem with intermediates, is that you are an intermediate lifter, but your entire experience of lifting is being a beginner. So you have a beginner's mindset and an intermediate's body, and it's going to take time to figure that out. It took me time, and now I try and give you guys this advice in these videos. So great question, per usual, BSO. Next question from Dark Knight. Can you explain with some detail what made you change your split from an upper-lower to an upper-lower push-pull legs, and who would benefit from doing the same or giving it a try as well. So this is what is best, in my opinion, for more advanced lifters. So that doesn't mean you have to be like a pro natural bodybuilder or have 18-inch arms. But I think people that are kind of at that like 16-inch plus arm mark, and that's just a very, 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 very general milestone that I would generally recommend it for. So if you're reasonably lean and have 16-inch arms, aka you're an intermediate to advanced lifter, I think that's a good point where you can probably start to focus on an upper lower push-pull legs instead. With that being said, you can certainly still make incredible gains on an upper lower split, and that's what I've been doing for the past year plus. As you guys know, you've seen my physique change quite a bit in the past year, and that was pretty much purely running an upper lower. So by no means is running an upper lower suboptimal or bad or anything for an intermediate or advanced lifter, but if you're someone that's detail and aesthetics oriented, and upper lower push pull legs gives you a more specific day to focus on different regions of a muscle. So beginners won't necessarily need this because you can maximize growth, not training all the way to failure. But for myself, or someone that is maybe a similar level to myself, if I was just to do a bunch of flat pressing, my upper chest wouldn't be stimulated enough to grow because I would need to hit it more directly to actually get it to grow now that its new gains and whatnot are kind of maxed out. So for me, a push day allows me to do a lift to bias the clavicular head of the pecs. It allows me to do one to bias the middle pecs, the sternal. It allows me to bias the costal, aka the lower pecs. So I can do 3 different push variations. My technique's great. My execution's great because I've been lifting for so long at this point. And I can really just make sure everything's biased. And the problem with this is you get beginners that want to do stuff like this when it's entirely redundant for them to do it. And then you get intermediates that just write it off entirely and they think just, oh, barbells and working hard is all you need. So it's a little bit backwards in my mind, but yeah, that's generally my thoughts on that question. So good question. Next one from Jay Gonzo. If we can emphasize upper chest through incline work, does that mean we can probably emphasize the inner chest, which a lot of guys seem to have lagging, myself included? So that is a really good question. And this one is a little bit painful for me to read and not have the best answer for you because right now, guys, I'm in my, I guess, I don't want to say biomechanics, but I would say regional hypertrophy / biomechanics phase at the moment, and that's what I'm really nerding out about. The problem with this stuff is it's much more scientific than something you can necessarily entirely learn purely through experience, which I'd argue programming is something you can learn pretty well through experience. Where the stuff is more science-based, I don't want to say it's out of my scope of practice because I think that's a little bit ridiculous, but what I'm trying to say is I want to maximize my knowledge before I make entire videos on it. Learning stuff about regional hypertrophy is tough because the science is incredibly blurry on it. We just don't have quite enough of a solid understanding about it. But with that said, I'm researching this stuff like crazy. I'm spending a lot of my time trying to learn as much as I possibly can, and of course, experiment with my own training about stuff like biasing the outer versus the inner pecs, or more specifically, biasing like a distal versus a proximal region of a muscle group. One little tidbit that I do feel comfortable giving out right now is that you almost certainly can bias a distal and a proximal region, especially the distal region. It seems to be that on the eccentric of your lifts, the distal region of the muscle is what grows the most from that eccentric. So I can't give any hard advice or any particular methods of how to maximize regional hypertrophy in that sense, but I'm trying to learn as much as I can, and as a lifting community, we're learning more about this kind of like every year or even like every month. So this is something that I'm in the trenches with right now, and as I have more information and more experience with it, I will be having more videos on it. And just so you guys know, this is my next phase basically on the channel. It'll just be a matter of time before I feel fully comfortable talking about topics like that, because I don't want to give out any type of like incorrect advice or just lead you guys down the wrong path or something. But I guess to expand on that point a little bit, I'm 100% a believer at this point in regional hypertrophy, biasing not just like different heads of a muscle, but also inner versus outer and all that kind of stuff. I do think it's possible. It's just a matter of how do we train to make that happen, and just kind of learning from there. Next question from Jan. Is block periodization relevant to hypertrophy training? I suspect no, but I'm interested in your thoughts. Thank you for the great content. I appreciate that, man. So when it comes to block periodization, in the definition that I have of block periodization is just separating your training based on certain blocks throughout the year, or a term that we more typically use in a hypertrophy training would just be a mesocycle. So is it relevant? Yes. Is it necessary? No. I think with separating your training based on mesocycles versus more of like kind of a I guess adaptation style program where you slowly refine and adapt things over time based on when they need to be refined, this mostly comes down to personality types. If you're someone that's kind of like you like to go with the flow and you don't need to be too structured, running a program like how I run mine, especially with my clients, is something that could work pretty well for you. So if you're someone that wants to just do the same thing until it doesn't work anymore, then go for it. Like a quick example for this is if on an upper day I have 5 lifts, one for each major muscle group of the upper body, then let's say my lift for chest is starting to either give me an injury or it plateaus, then I would rotate a lift, then that's fine. I can keep everything else out and just rotate that. That's an example of how I generally program, and that's arguably the most optimal way to do it for hypertrophy. With that said, if you're someone that is a little bit more of an analytical mind, and if you're somebody that does like to either have different phases biasing different goals, that's totally fine too. So if you want to do like 10-week mesocycles where you focus on 10 lifts and just mastering and building up those lifts over a 10-week block, and then for the next block you want to make a few rotations or measure progress and start a new block with entirely new lifts or something like that, that's okay. I think they're just two different things, but they'll probably give you pretty similar results at the end of the day. It's just a matter of how you like to organize and think. It's definitely more psychological than it is physical when it comes to differing, whether you're more of like an auto-regulation type person where you have kind of set systems for when you make rotations or changes, or someone that does like to say 10-week block, 10-week block, 10-week block, and just have everything a bit more organized, I guess. Next question from Ali. If I'm progressing fine on 2 sets, should I increase them to 3 to 4, even though progress is not stopping? This question I actually already answered earlier in the Q&A, so I apologize, but I'll give you props and I'll give you a little shout out for asking a good question as well, but someone already asked that. Next question from Seek Rum. I think that's how you say it, Seek Rum. I'm, again, probably pronouncing that wrong. I just saw the accident of the bodybuilder in Indonesia and got terrified. Could you share some safety tips when we go for heavy squats? So yes, if you're somebody that does tend to fall forwards or lean forwards in your squats, first I would encourage you to fix your technique, and I would encourage you to think of your chest and your hips moving as one. They move at the same time in the same order. They go together. This way, you're not in a situation where you're starting to lean forwards and the bar could roll onto your neck. With that said, it's never a bad idea to have spotters, especially on the side. Having one person behind you can definitely help to move your own torso, but they're not in a good spot to have leverage to actually handle the bar. Side spotters, especially if you're going heavy, can definitely be a pretty big help. With that said, it's also not a bad idea to practice bailing or to practice failing a squat. So if you're squatting with bumper plates in a squat stand, it's not a bad idea to learn how to bail out of your squat. If you're squatting in a squat rack with cast iron plates and you have spotter arms in the cage, it's also not a bad idea to learn how to dump the bar. And it's also a pretty good idea to actually accurately measure where your spotter arms should be. So put them at the highest possible setting that you can that doesn't quite touch the bottom of your squat. And it's at the end of the day, like the what happened to this person in Indonesia, and rest in peace to him. It was horrible to see. I did see it yesterday. I think a situation like this is not that there's nothing that someone could have done to fix that. Of course, there were a few things in that situation that could have potentially saved him. Obviously, like better spotting and spotter arms and a better squat rack and that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, I do see this as probably more of a freak accident, just based on what happened with the bar and how it ended up rolling forwards. Yeah, it's awful to see, and it's something that it's never a bad idea to know how to bail, to have spotters that know what they're doing and truly know what they're doing, and people that are actually comfortable spotting you on your squats and learning how to use safety equipment and what height to put your spotter arms at. None of that's a bad idea. So I wouldn't want you to be scared of like doing a squat or something, but with that said, just make sure you know how to do it safely and make sure your spotters are actually comfortably spotting you. Next question from Volker Paul Wilhelm. He says, what are your thoughts on the claim that working out is inherently far right, quote unquote? So obviously anybody in their right frame of mind, no pun intended, knows that this is just a ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous to say that. I think ultimately, so for anybody that isn't from America or isn't familiar with maybe this quote or something, essentially what's going on here is basically it's liberal media that is trying to make anybody that isn't liberal seem like far right. Like I remember watching all this stuff kind of go down, especially during the shutdown a few years ago, where anyone that I think there was a headline like the far right's obsession with home gym fitness, and I was like, oh well, apparently I'm far right now. So ultimately, I don't think it's out of the question to say the conservative mindset and the conservative ideology at its heart and at its core is the pursuit of personal responsibility. And I think that one of the most important aspects of personal responsibility is your health and your confidence, which basically that's what working out does. So you could say it's kind of by nature a conservative ideology, like it's something that conservative people do and should pursue. But with that said, to say it's like exclusive to conservatives or like far right extremists or something is obviously nuts. It's hard to say that and not laugh. It's absurd, but yeah, I think ultimately it's just like far left news sources that are trying to control what they can, or just to clickbait basically. That's pretty much what I see in that. I'm not someone that follows the news a whole ton or politics a whole ton, but from a non-emotional, non-biased perspective, that's essentially what I think is going on there. Next question from Megan. I get crazy butt wink when I do standard barbell back squats. I tried playing with stance width and using an elevation. Does this mean I'm not built for the lift, and should I look for alternatives? So I wouldn't say that you're not built for that lift. I think if you want to maximize hypertrophy and your basically hip tightness isn't allowing you to maximize, say, the range of motion for your knees, aka your quads, you're probably leaving some gains on the table. So what I'd say for you is, if you're looking to train your hips through the maximum range of motion that you can on a squat, then you're perfectly fine to do that, because that's what gives out first, obviously in your squat with that crazy butt wink. So if you're able to go down to right before you get the butt wink and then come back up, you're doing the best you can to train your hips in that lift. With that said, if you're getting to like a little bit above parallel with a low bar squat and you're really only getting your knees to about 90 degrees, doing something like a hack squat where you're not getting quite as much bend at the hips and you're getting a ton of bend at the knees can definitely bring up your quads quite a bit. And I would argue that you're probably leaving gains on the table if you aren't taking advantage of something that is pushing your hips forwards and letting you get a little bit more range of motion at the knees before the hips. So I wouldn't necessarily look for alternatives, but I would add something in like a hack squat or a similar lift that allows you to maximize the quads, and you should be good from there. But with that said, if you're not really feeling much pain, or you're not really going too extreme into the butt wink, like if you're just getting a little bit at the bottom and you're not trying to really force it, and you don't feel any pain or have any recovery issues, you should be fine to have a little bit of butt wank. It's not the end of the world. You're not going to just snap up your back from being reasonable with it, is what I'm trying to say. Next question from Julius Caesar. Tips for construction workers. Started such a job recently paired with my sleep troubles. My progress plans are slowly going down the drain. So congrats on the new job, man. I know it's very strenuous physically, but having a job like that seems to be rewarding from the construction workers that I've talked to. So that's cool. I would say doing more frequent sessions, but doing less per session. So something like a low volume approach where you're maybe doing something like even like a push-pull leg split where you're still hitting everything twice a week. You're in the gym a lot. Yeah, you're going to have to make some type of sacrifice, but at the end of the day, if you can get in and out in 45 minutes, because if you're doing say 8-hour shifts that are very labor intensive, or even 10 or 12-hour shifts that are also labor intensive, it is tough to say get in like a full upper body workout or full lower body workout or something like that with maybe like extra back work and stuff. So I'd say something like a push pull legs where you can go low volume. I'd superset as much as you possibly can, and just kind of take it from there. Next question from Ice or Icy. Will you ever return to strength training on the big three? I won't, and that's not because it's not okay to strength train on the big three, but I wasn't doing it because I wanted to do it. I was doing it because people told me that was the best way to get big. So I was doing it because I thought that I needed to hit certain numbers and needed to do those 3 lifts to be as big as I possibly could. And now that I've realized that not only do I not need to do those lifts, doing those lifts and chasing numbers is actually counterproductive for maximizing hypertrophy, I certainly won't go back to them because I just don't really care. I really don't care about strength. That's not my cup of tea, so I have absolutely no reason to go back. Next question from Papa Smurf. What is your opinion on deloading for hypertrophy? Does it have any benefits or is it just a waste of time? Deloading for hypertrophy isn't necessary in my opinion. I think a lot of the time you'll find other reasons to skip the gym that will count as a deload to let some of your fatigue dissipate. So that could be something like a vacation or even kind of getting sick or even just taking a few days off after getting sick. We all have like random things that come up throughout the year that kind of force us to take time off. So I don't think it's entirely necessary just because life, quote unquote, can get in the way sometimes. I kind of hate that quote because a lot of people use it as an excuse not to lift consistently, but there is a grain of truth to it. I think at the same time, hypertrophy training proper hypertrophy training doesn't produce enough systemic fatigue to require something like a deload. And there's really no benefit to it anyways, because you're not a sustainable hypertrophy program doesn't just build up so much fatigue to where you have to just take a week off and then your gains aren't magically better after taking a week off. If there's any like sliver of benefit from taking a week off to get you some form of resensitization, at that point, just taking the week off is going to counteract that. So what's the point in my mind? Just find something that's sustainable. If you have to deload all the time, there's probably something else that's wrong with your training and recovery. Next question from Bob Dreams. What's the best way to develop a physique that'll look good in clothes? Greetings from Holland. Greetings, Bob. I would say the best way to develop a physique that looks good in clothes is to grow the traps and the delts. Those are going to be key. Growing the lats as much as you can too. That does a lot. I would also say the long head of the tricep is incredibly helpful. You can have huge biceps, but at rest, the triceps are really what's going to basically make you look big and make you look jacked in a shirt. The traps are also going to kind of pull everything up and make them tighter. And then the delts, you can even see just in this flannel, like if I go back into the right lighting, you can see the delts are popping out on the side. It's going to make a big difference. So delts are super important. Side delts, rear delts, triceps, the entire back. Don't worry too much about like the spinal erectors and low back. Focus primarily on the big hitters, aka the traps, all regions, lats, all regions. Get your delts big, get your triceps big, and you're good. A lot of people like to say the chest is overrated. I disagree. I think the chest is very important too. But a lot of people already put emphasis there anyways, so there's no need to overemphasize. Next question from Belgian Blue. Do you have a goal physique? If so, who can be a real life person or a fictional character? So I don't have a goal physique as I touched on earlier. I really don't. It's kind of an interesting phase because, like I said earlier, I've always had someone that I've like wanted to look like, or a physique that I've been trying to like aspire to. I'd say the closest thing I have to a goal physique would just be kind of like I would say my quote unquote competition. It's kind of ridiculous to say that, but someone like Alex Leonidas is somebody that I think I have vaguely similar genetics to, kind of a similar structure to where he's someone that's like a good comparable for someone like myself. If I was to compare myself to someone like, I don't know, say like Jeffrey Verity Schofield, you guys all know who he is. That would be dumb of me because he's taller, he's like limb dominant, and I'm shorter and more torso dominant. So there's no comparison. There's no point in me trying to look like him because even if I had the same measurements and everything as him, our physiques would look entirely different. I think with somebody like Alex Leonidas, it's a good comparison because I think with similar measurements and similar proportions, we actually would look pretty similar. I've noticed that with a handful of muscle groups. I think the back, the triceps are definitely pretty similar. He's definitely got me on forearms, but I think even shoulders, we kind of have like similar-ish quote unquote insertions and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's having someone that you can kind of like draw comparisons to is helpful. I wouldn't say I have anybody that I'm trying to like look like. I don't think I'm trying to look like him or anything. I'm just trying to maximize my physique and the muscles that I want to grow. But I think he's a cool comparison, and it's a good gauge for me to base my progress off of, I'd say. And next question from Azim: how do we know if we're doing junk volume? The best way to find out if you're doing junk volume is to reduce your volume slowly until you realize that you're doing not enough to make progress. So if you get to a point where your measurements aren't increasing much, or with your feedback in your training program isn't going to how it used to be. So this is what I do. Slowly chip away volume. If you're asking that question, I know somebody did reply to that question. If you are asking that question, you might be doing junk volume. I think if that's on your mind, it's probably something that you are potentially doing. But at the same time, junk volume isn't going to kill you. It's just going to take away from other areas of your program, and it's probably just going to take up a bit more of your time. So don't be too stressed about it. But if you feel like you might have junk volume in your program, slowly reduce your volume until you're at a point where you find out what your kind of like maintenance volume, or what your minimum effective volume, to say the right term, truly is. Last question for the Q&A. This has been a long one. From Wings3647, he asks, is a bad program better than program hopping on a good program? So is running a bad program better than program hopping on a good program? There's a lot to unpack here because there's so many variables that go into it. For the good programs, how similar are they? Are you changing frequency a whole ton? Are you changing exercise selection a whole ton? Are you a beginner that doesn't really have that much coordination or understanding of lifts and proximity to failure yet? I would say for beginners, following a bad program is, generally speaking, going to be better than program hopping on good programs. The better you get at lifting and the more muscle you have and the more advanced you get in general, the more you could probably get away with actually program hopping a little bit more. Because I know for myself, let's say it's like a machine-based program where I'm already a more advanced lifter. With something like this, where one, my skill is pretty high with lifting, I have a good understanding and I've made progress for years, so I know what makes progress and what doesn't make progress. I have a good understanding of training and programming. I could probably get away with program hopping, especially on a program that has low skill lifts. So if I'm just doing like mainly machines and cables and that kind of stuff, I could probably get away with it. As a beginner, probably not so much. But it totally depends on the program, depends on the lifts in the program and what major variables are being changed. So it's a really good question. It's probably something that would need its own video to give you a more in-depth answer on. But I would say if you're newer to lifting, probably just stick with the bad program, although just get a good program. Like this is where it's a hypothetical question. And if you're more advanced and you're deciding between a bad program and program hopping on good programs in the right scenario could actually work better. So it's a really tough question to answer in limited time. And if I want to revisit this topic at some point down the road for fun, I actually might do it. So with that being said, that's the entire Q&A. Thanks everybody if you watched entirely through that. I really do appreciate it. Thanks a ton for 15K. It's unreal to even think about that. 20K is next, and that's pretty much all I got for you. So enjoy the rest of your day. See you guys soon.